thank you so much for inviting me. It's really nice to be here, and thank you for enduring my English. My Danish is not good enough to give a talk. So I'm just going to talk about and introduce my most recent book, which is a little essay poem entitled On the Literary Means of Representing the Powerful as Powerless. The title is pretty self-explanatory. It's just kind of a series of book reports on books that depict power as inherently weak. So along with many other poets, I'm interested in the essay as a poetic mode. It's a form that accommodates provisional thinking, flexibility, and incompleteness. Not every essay traffics in those qualities, of course, but an unfinished malleability of thought is part of the genre. That's probably why so many poets gravitate toward it, because, like poetry, essays have no clear definition and facilitate open-ended thinking. A famous example of a poet tackling the form is Susan Howe's My Emily Dickinson, which maybe some of you know, which argues that literary scholarship has done a disservice to Dickinson's writing by ignoring the poem's dense elusiveness, their references to Dickinson's wide literary knowledge, and by disregarding her formal experimentation, the punctuation and the notation, which is pretty idiosyncratic. Howe makes these arguments disjunctively through clipped sentences and a collage of quotations. Her point is clear, and the book functions as a scholarly argument, but it also works as a poem. A less famous example would be Louis Zukofsky's Bottom on Shakespeare, a totally bonkers and borderline unreadable 700-page meditation on how knowledge is acquired through the senses, composed in large part of lengthy quotations from other writers and an operatic score by Cecilia Zukofsky that sets excerpts of Shakespeare to music. So when I started working on this book, I was very conscious of this history, and I was conscious that other poets are interested in the essay form too, that there's a surge of interest in it. I wanted to write a book that was part of this trajectory, a way to write poetry that forefronted direct argument and explicit political statement while also avoiding sloganeering. So I'll read you the opening couple pages. It goes without saying, haha, that it's difficult today to imagine the people who hold power. Of course, we're inundated with the faces of certain politicians who often seem more like celebrities than political actors, though I assume that some make decisions that affect people's lives, determining who's rich and poor, healthy and sick, free and incarcerated, dead and alive. There's nothing mysterious about these celebrity politicians. Even if they occasionally take ownership of legislation that expands or contracts rights, no one believes that they actually come up with new laws. Everyone knows that they simply back legislation for political expediency or to appease someone who needs them to back it. I need you to back this. I really need you to do this for me. I think we understand each other. I know what you need. I'm so glad we understand each other. We were made for each other. I really think we were made for each other. Do you understand? Are you sure you understand? I think you understand. Further, that someone who needs the law is probably not a particular person, but a hidden group of advocates and administrators who work for the government, or for a non-governmental body, or for a corporation, or for an organization that lobbies for the interests of small businesses, or for a small business, or for a medium-sized business. Some business people are, of course, also celebrities. I built a financial empire. I'm an example of what's possible. If I could do it, you could do it too. It's all mine. I wasn't born into money. I did it myself. I did it alone. As a child, I sold chewing gum door to door. I took a public speaking course. I bought a 30-acre farm with a tenant farmer. I bought 7% of Coca-Cola. I invested in media. No charges were brought. The antitrust suits were dropped. I was in the right place at the right time. I gave to charity. I set up a foundation. But most business people and politicians are nameless and faceless, and it would be hard to determine whom they work for or if they have beliefs that influence what they do. The point is, the situation is vague, and the questions arising from such a vague situation are themselves so vague that they're obvious, and it seems naive to ask them. Who are they? What do they do? What do they look like? How are they connected? How do they antagonize each other? How do they put their differences aside to plot against us? Where do they meet to do this plotting? The emptiness of these questions is not entirely my fault. It's part of the problem. Obviousness, like circumspection, is built into power structures. And pointing to this obviousness can be edifying as well as mystifying, which is how hierarchies run smoothly. And even though the concrete violence, economic, psychological, physical, that results from power structures is not vague and never obvious, because a specific act of violence can never be obvious. At whichever point you discover how power works, you find that you already knew that, and the person you're condescendingly explaining it to already knew it too. Why are you telling me this? Do you think I'm stupid? I know that. Do you think I don't know that already? Let's talk about something else. Let's just drop it. I'm sick of this. I'm so sick of this. Why can't we ever talk about what I want to talk about? What is that supposed to mean? You already said that. Why can't you just say it clearly or let me talk? Literature, of course, is not better or worse at representing political reality than other media. And it's arguably less adept at capturing the urgency of struggle because it's not as visceral as, say, film, or as immediate as, say, painting. But the slow unfurling of literature, its abstracted textures, as one reads word by word and yet imagines complex, unfinished patterns of meaning, makes it good at other things, like gnawing at the coherency of heroism and the indivisibility of power. After all, one often closes a book in the middle of the action. It's time for work. It's time for dinner. Honey, why are you crying? Did you fall? Did you scrape your knee? Did you feed the cat? Do you think this milk has gone bad? Will you smell this milk and tell me if you think it's gone bad? I think it might still be all right. It smells a little funny, but it's probably fine. What do you think? But there's another, almost simpler, more thematic way in which literature is against power. Characters are rarely depicted as actually, truly powerful. And even if they are, books also spend so much time elaborating a world or introducing other characters or rendering divided psychological states or tracing convoluted backstories that there's rarely a singular center of conflict. So my argument is simple. Literature has a special ability, interest, habit, or tendency. All of these words are vague, and maybe an even vaguer word would be more appropriate, to represent the powerful as powerless. It has a special way of representing power as illusory and contingent. If one learned about powerful people only from books, one would know that they're dumb, vain, smelly, confused, laughable, and feeble. Yes, this is a very general statement, impossible to prove. That's okay. That doesn't mean it's untrue or meaningless, and even if it is, that's okay too. Simultaneously, when I was writing this, I was also thinking about essay films, certain works by Chris Marker, Harun Faraki, Agnes Varda, etc. These films use voiceovers and argumentation poetically, but they don't shy away from presenting their images as real. They make salient and even strident political arguments about the existing world while treating the disjunctions and surprises of poetic thinking as an inherent part of that world. Because film is so good at capturing reality, I was originally planning to weave film criticism into my discussions of literature. But I decided to keep that to a minimum and instead take inspiration from film's relationship to reality, to write about literature while consistently pointing to the social world outside of books. Of course, I wanted this book's disjunctions, interruptions, and digressions to be playful, but I didn't want them to take away from a sense that the work was reflecting on both literature and social life, and literature as a part of social life. In Patricia Highsmith's story, The Day of Reckoning, an old farmer, unable to keep up with advances in industrial agriculture and finding it difficult to make ends meet, revives the family business by converting to battery farming. Much of the daily work is mechanized, production is increased, and the farm is saved from financial ruin. Each chicken lives in its own little wire coop, so small that there's no room to turn around. They hurt themselves attempting to fly. The floor is slanted, inclining the birds toward the feed trough, from which they continually eat food filled with vitamins and antibiotics that cause them to lay more eggs. The lights are turned on and off so that the chickens are tricked into experiencing the day 6 hours long, and an artificial spring period is maintained for the hen's whole lifetime of 10 months. All this drives the birds insane. Some refuse to eat, and others attempt to peck each other to death and eat each other through the cages. To prevent this, their beaks are filed down. Overstuffed and unceasingly immobile, they can barely walk. If one gets out of its cage, it stumbles and flails wildly. But the farmer doesn't care. He's obsessed with his profits. It's all he can talk about. He proselytizes about the benefits of battery farming and incessantly drones on to his family about their improving economic situation. One day, while chasing a kitten, his daughter is hit on the head by a piece of machinery and dies. The farmer's wife, devastated, opens the cages and tricks her husband into going into the barn. Then she locks the door. The chickens peck him to death until he's unrecognizable, quote, a fallen column of blood and bone to which a few tatters of pajama cloth still clung. But despite ending with a satisfying scene of revenge, Highsmith's story is more complicated than my summary makes it sound. I'm just rushing through a broad outline so you know what I'm talking about. Imagine other plot elements that derail the moral and thwart the implication that justice is symmetrical. It should be clear enough what I'm against, the consolidation of power. I think very straightforwardly that the future depends on making sure that there are no more billionaires and that power is not held in a small number of hands. But despite the negativity of this conviction, I wanted this book to be affirmative. That's its gambit. It argues that we have experiential and bodily knowledge of the fallibility of power, that literature has been historically a means of expressing and recording this knowledge. This isn't a novel or unique insight, but it bears repeating. Repeating is a way of remembering it and feeling it anew. It's a celebration of the obvious. And the obvious, after all, is not merely the banal or the facile. It's also the felt, the present, what's held in common. It's funny when films represent a couple's unhappiness by showing them sleeping back to back or on opposite sides of the bed. As if happy couples embrace all night, as if they don't jerk apart and spread their legs awkwardly or curl up like adolescents. I started thinking about this trope after watching Claire Denis' Trouble Every Day. There's a scene in which Vincent Gallo and Trisha Vesey are sleeping back to back on opposite sides of the bed. Gallo is awake, and it's obvious that the distance between them is supposed to symbolize emotional distance. The problem is that Gallo contracted some sort of disease or something while on a colonial scientific mission or something that makes him passionately cannibalistic. And he's desperately trying to refrain from eating Trisha Vesey. She doesn't know this, and he can't tell her, and that accounts for the distance. But I think sleeping back to back is actually very comfortable. It's a wonderful way to sleep, because when you wake up in the middle of the night, you can roll over and look at the other person sleeping and feel almost unbearably close, as if you could read their thoughts. Or you can continue facing away, staring blankly at the wall, feeling unwatched, as if your thoughts were your own. But the bodily is not just knowledge, conscious or not. It can't be reduced to knowledge or elevated to the level of knowledge. And the body is never only obvious. There's too much about it that's never obvious, that we can only experience at a remove through our neurotic or speculative relationship to ourselves. So I wanted to end this book with, it's really a series of book reports, as I said, that goes through a lot of different books and kind of creates a very haphazard taxonomy of ways power is represented. But I won't read you all those book reports. But I wanted to end the work with a left turn, to shift into a more personal mode that would be difficult to fully reconcile with what preceded it. Despite all the book's attempts to juggle arguments and to speak in different voices, there was still something about it, something native to the very idea of the book, that felt overly authoritative, as if the whole point of the project were to get my point across. One of the little narratives threaded throughout is a conceit that I wrote it all in one day. I repeatedly come back to this. I'm writing this in one day. So it seemed intuitive to end the book with the end of that day, when my body and mind are tired, but still wound up from writing and reading. I decided that ending on a personal note would bestow a little extra warmth on the rest of the text, retroactively, while contextualizing the work historically and personally. If I had put such material at the beginning of the book, personal material at the beginning of the book, it might sum up or frame the arguments in advance. But at the end of the book, I think the personal writing helps dissolve the argument, not to ruin it. I didn't want to ruin the argument because I do believe in it, and besides, it's already been made. But I wanted it to fade out so that it becomes more diffuse and merges with other material. Once again, I can't sleep. Tired of writing about books, I've been lying in bed and searching the internet for articles about how my pacemaker could fail. It was easy to find information about various pacemaker malfunctions, but most glitches are rare. It was difficult to find dramatic stories about terrifying near-death experiences. That's what I was looking for. I wanted to know what could go wrong at any moment. I wanted to lay awake and worry. I wanted the worry to be compounded by more worry, to overtake me, to ruin the night. But after reading a few technical publications, I felt better. There are so many safety features. I had always assumed that there were more things that could go horribly wrong, potential malfunctions that I wouldn't want to know about. But I searched for hours and I couldn't find anything scary. Nothing can kill me. There's blunt trauma-induced pacemaker failure, of course, which could kill me, especially because my heart is fully paced. I have no detectable natural heartbeat. So if my pacemaker were smashed, my heart would either stop completely or slow to a dangerously slack and irregular rhythm. But I'm not really scared of blunt trauma-induced pacemaker failure because there's only two ways that could happen. Either someone intentionally hits me with something, or I'm accidentally hit by something. If I imagine someone doing it intentionally, which I sometimes do, especially when someone really hates me, I get nervous, sure, but I'm not specifically scared of the blunt force. I'm frightened by the hatred and anger that someone feels toward me. And if I imagine an accident, say a car crash, then my fears are equally unrelated to the fragility of the pacemaker itself. I'm simply scared of dying in a car crash, and lots of people are scared of dying in a car crash, whether or not they have pacemakers. Lots of people are laying awake right now, fantasizing about dying in car crashes, imagining themselves flying through the windshield, crumpled on the roadside, glass embedded in their face, wishing they could just fall the fuck to sleep. Why can't I ever just fucking fall to sleep? It hurts to be awake all night. When I last had a new pacemaker implanted, the wound didn't heal for weeks. It repeatedly reopened and festered. The skin turned green. You could see through a hole in my chest to the shiny metal surface of the device. I couldn't sleep then either. I compulsively pressed my fingers to the bandage to rouse the wound's soreness. Whenever the pain faded, I pressed harder to call it back. I wrote about this in another poem, but I don't think it was clear, and so I'd like to write it one more time and then never again. I have no heartbeat because my teenage father was drafted into a vicious imperialist war. Posted as a topographer, he wandered through unfamiliar Vietnamese forests as the defoliate Agent Orange rained down on his head. The children of people exposed to Agent Orange suffered health problems from birth. No one knows how many Vietnamese children were born disfigured, thousands at least. That war is in my body. But as long as no one smashes my pacemaker, my heart should keep beating for now, more or less steadily. Of course, a heartbeat is never perfectly steady. It varies imperceptibly, continuously. I confess, my love of reading was nursed by my inability to exercise or vigorously play. Until I was 16, my heart rate did not alter with activity. Back then, pacemaker technology was not yet able to vary heart rate to correspond with the rhythm of the body. My heartbeat stayed more or less the same, around 70 beats per minute, and if I ran or strained myself, I immediately became pale, tired, and sick. I hid in my room and I read. And my hatred of power and of those who desire authority, strength, or war is almost certainly tied, however obliquely, to this experience of physical limitation and to the visceral knowledge found in books that power is sustained by such feelings of limitation. According to the National Center for Biotechnology Information website, there's a condition in which some people continuously play with, rub, or twiddle their pacemaker. Because elderly patients often have very little muscle mass, they're able to touch the device through the thin skin of their chest, which they may do compulsively without being conscious of it. Quote, "The pacemaker twiddler's syndrome is an uncommon cause of pacemaker malfunction. It occurs due to unintentional or deliberate manipulation of the pacemaker pulse generator within its skin pocket by the patient, leading to a painless dislodgement of device. Subsequent coiling of the lead causes lead dislodgement, ultimately resulting in pacemaker malfunction. More commonly reported among elderly females with impaired cognition, the phenomenon usually occurs in the first year following pacemaker implantation." Thank you.